Senator from Florida.
Madam President, a number of people have asked me to comment about the situation since President Putin has moved aggressively with regard to Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And therefore, there has been some retaliation of sanctions by the United States against Russia. And now we are hearing comments out of Russia by the Deputy Prime Minister who has the responsibility for defense and aerospace, a number of troubling statements, such as, since the U.S., until we complete our development of rockets that can again take Americans on American rockets to and from the International Space Station. He's made a sarcastic comment, something like, well, how do the Americans think they are going to get to the space station? On a trampoline? And then, most recently, a statement having been issued in his name that Russia, the Russian rocket company, will not sell the very efficient and very energetic Russian rocket engine, the RD-180, will not sell that to the United States for military purposes. This is a very complex issue. It affects not only our military access to space, it affects our civilian access to space. And let me, in about 4 minutes, see if I can dissect this, as a number of people have asked me about this, and this will be an issue, for example, next week in the markup in the Senate Armed Services Committee of the Armed Services Defense Authorization Bill. Now, first of all, let's go back and see the history. How do we have this relationship with Russia, and what is it? Well, it's interesting that in the midst of the Cold War, when there were the two superpowers, it was the Soviet Union and the United States that decided to cooperate in space in the civilian program. And in the midst of the Cold War, leading up to the launch in 1975, a Russian Soyuz and an American Apollo spacecraft, Apollo-Soyuz, it is known as, rendezvoused and docked, and the crews lived together in space for 9 days, 1975. By the way, those two crews, led by General Alexei Leonov of the Soviet Union and General Tom Stafford, United States Air Force General, NASA astronaut, Apollo 10 that went to the moon, those two are close personal friends today and have seen each other over the course of the years many times. I had the privilege as a young congressman of taking a delegation in 1985 to the Soviet Union on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of Apollo-Soyuz, with our Apollo astronauts joining in Moscow with the Soviet cosmonauts. So there's a long history. But now, fast forward up to 1991, I think is the year, and it is the complete destruction of the old Soviet Union, and all the satellite states go elsewhere. By the way, this is right after, this is in August and September of 1991, interestingly, after a delegation of American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts in April of 91 have all joined together out at Star City where they train their cosmonauts, and then we all go in a Soviet military plane out to Kazakhstan to the launch site on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the launch of the first human into space, and that was a Russian, Yuri Gagarin. And so shortly after this, a few months later, the Soviet Union disintegrates. And so the United States had a choice to make. Where are all of those very bright, very effective Russian scientists in their defense program and in their space program? Often their civilian space program was directly linked to their Soviet military program. Where are all those scientists going to go? We don't want them to go to Iran, North Korea, China. So the United States, and I believe it was Senator Sam Nunn, Democrat, and Senator Dick Lugar, Republican, that led the effort to put together the Nunn-Lugar bill, which started sending American assistance to try to stop the scientists from fleeing into other hands, and especially to corral all of the nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had. And that was done very effectively. And one tiny aspect of that was because we then found out when Russia opened its former Soviet closed doors, we found out that the Russian scientists and engineers had manufactured this exceptionally efficient and powerful engine, kerosene and LOX, liquid oxygen, called the RD-180. And as a result, we worked out a deal between American aerospace companies and the Russian company called Energomash, where instead of these engines going all across the world, we were going to use them together. And so the United States, through its rocket manufacturers, formerly I believe it was Pratt Whitney, they got the license to this and the plans to the engine, but they also had the agreement that they would buy these from the Russian rocket manufacturer. Now today, that engine is a staple, a necessary engine in our stable of horses to get into space, both military and civilian, because it is the main engines on what today we use as the Atlas V rocket. This is a proven rocket. It's had an unblemished record, and that unblemished record has been something like close to, if not over, 100 straight flights without a flaw. And that rocket is being planned for in the future by Boeing to put a Boeing spacecraft on top of it for humans to go to and from the space station, and planned for by another company called Sierra Nevada, which has created a smaller winged spacecraft, not unlike the space shuttle, but much, much smaller, that will go on top of the Atlas V, also for humans. and they, along with a third competitor, now going into a competition in NASA, the third competitor being SpaceX, which has built its own rocket called the Falcon 9 with its spacecraft, the Dragon capsule. Those three will compete to see if one or all three are the ones that deliver humans, Americans and Russians, to the International Space Station in the future, instead of us having to rely, after we shut down the space shuttle, on the only human-tested rocket to get us to and from the space station now, which is the Soyuz, the Russian rocket that launches from Baikonur, Kazakhstan. Now, if this isn't confusing enough, now the Deputy Prime Minister, provoked because the United States has responded to President Putin's aggression, says he's going to stop selling the Energomash rocket to the United States for military purposes. The question is he going to continue to sell that rocket engine for civilian purposes, which I just outlined in this competition that's coming up? And if this is accurate and it holds, what to do for the United States? Well, we have several options. First of all, we have a 2-year supply on the shelf of these engines. And if we think in 2 years that the Russians are not going to continue to sell this, and by the way, this is a real job maker for Russians and a money maker for them. They want, I can tell you, the aerospace industry in Russia, they want to continue to sell this engine. But if the politics gets in the way and they cut it off, then what is the United States to do? Well, we got to figure that out. Right now, there's a study going on in the Department of Defense as to how we would handle it. We've got a 2-year supply. One of the options they'll look at is stretching that out over time, putting some of those payloads on other rockets. There are some of those payloads that can go on the very successful Falcon 9. But there are heavier payloads that cannot go on the Falcon 9, that could go on the Atlas V, but if the Atlas V is not flying, have to go on a more expensive and heavier lift, Delta IV Heavy. But that's more expensive. And so you see how complicated this gets. And then the question is, well, can we really bank on, if they're not going to sell these engines for military purposes, can we really bank on it that they would sell these engines for NASA civilian purposes? And that's a big question mark. And so one of the things in this DoD study is going to be, can we manufacture, since we have the plans? That we don't know the answer to at this point. It's an extremely complicated metallurgy process that they had perfected in all of those years in the old Soviet Union, that we would have to, starting flat-footed, even though we have the plans, figure out how to do that, do all the design equipment, all the processing equipment, and then try to get the engines ready. And at some point, what would a follow-on engine look like? Now, that's about the best that I can summarize the situation, but we're going to have some major decisions to make here, depending on what we see on the DoD study. First of all, we're going to have to know how we have assured access to space for defense purposes for the national security of this country. Secondly, we're going to have assured access to space for the civilian program so that this incredible international space station that we have built with 15 nations, including the Russians, have been a major partner, how we are going to keep that operating and to get Americans to and from, because the Russians cannot operate the space station by themselves. In the first place, a lot of the Russian commands to their own modules actually are commands that go through the Johnson Space Center in Texas. And secondly, the Russians depend on all the electricity that is generated on the International Space Station from the American electrical systems. And so we're going to have to continue to operate it together. The Deputy Prime Minister implied that he would continue to do that through the year 2020. But the space station is going to have a life, and should have, well into the end of the decade of the 2030s. So these are the questions we're going to have to answer, and they're going to have to be answered in the near future. And in part, some of them are going to have to be answered next week as we start to mark up the defense authorization bill. I wanted to give the Senate and all of those in the press that have been asking me the best of what I could conclude at this point, and then we will see what develops. There was the new development, as I mentioned yesterday, where the Deputy Prime Minister said they won't sell the RD-180 to America for military purposes. If that holds, then we've got to swing into action pretty quick. Madam President, I yield the floor. Made a sarcastic comment, something like, well, how do the Americans think they are going to get to the space station? On a trampoline? And then, most recently, a statement having been issued in his name that Russia, the Russian rocket company, will not sell the very efficient and very energetic Russian rocket engine, the RD-180, will not sell that to the United States for military purposes. This is a very complex issue. It affects not only our military access to space, it affects our civilian access to space. And let me, in about 4 minutes, see if...
Senator from Florida.
Madam President, a number of people have asked me to comment about the situation since President Putin has moved aggressively with regard to Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And therefore, there has been some retaliation of sanctions by the United States against Russia. And now we are hearing comments out of Russia. If I can dissect this, as a number of people have asked me about this, and this will be an issue, for example, next week in the markup in the Senate Armed Services Committee of the Armed Services Defense Authorization Bill. Now, first of all, let's go back and see the history. How do we have this relationship with Russia, and what is it? Well, it's interesting by the Deputy Prime Minister who has the responsibility for defense and aerospace, a number of troubling statements, such as, since the U.S., until we complete our development of rockets that can again take Americans on American rockets to and from the International Space Station, he's made